As the U.S. and China engage in a heated trade war, Beijing vows a decisive response to Washington's escalating tariffs. China has retaliated with its own tariffs targeting U.S. agricultural exports. The conflict threatens global economic stability, with both nations locked in a cycle of retaliation. As tensions rise, the world watches anxiously. Will Beijing's strong stance lead to a resolution, or will it further entrench the trade standoff between these two economic giants? Well, in depth. Beijing imposed broad tariffs on U.S. food imports and banned 15 American companies from buying from China without special permission, as reported by the New York Times. Shortly after Trump's tariffs took effect, the Chinese government announced that it would essentially halt sales to 15 American companies. Additionally, a Chinese spokesperson criticized the U.S. for violating the World Trade Organization's free trade rules. Also, the spokesperson signaled China's emerging strategy in dealing with Trump's tariffs by calling for closer trade relations with Europe.
In a tense global climate, Beijing has declared its readiness to confront the United States in what could escalate into a full-blown trade war. This declaration follows Washington's imposition of new tariffs on Chinese goods, a move that has been met with swift and stern condemnation from Beijing. China has signaled it is prepared to fight until the end in response to rising trade tensions and military posturing. This strong response came after the United States announced a 20% tariff increase on Chinese goods. China swiftly retaliated by imposing tariffs ranging from 10% to 15% on selected U.S. imports, effective from March 10th. Adding to the tension, China has announced a 7.2% increase in its defense spending, earmarking approximately $250 billion for military modernization by 2027. Premier Li Qiang emphasized the nation's commitment to safeguarding its sovereignty and security interests amidst unprecedented changes on the global stage. China may also try to capitalize on the U.S.'s strained relationships with allies like Canada and Mexico, who also face tariffs. As the world watches, the future of U.S.-China relations hangs in the balance. The Chinese recent rhetoric suggests a shift in strategy. The coming days will be crucial in determining whether the two economic superpowers can find a path toward de-escalation, or if they are destined for a prolonged and damaging trade war. The global implications of this confrontation are far-reaching, with potential impacts on trade, technology, and geopolitics.
And for more analysis, we're joined by Mr. Inar Tanjin, Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute from Beijing. And we're also joined by Professor Gilles-Emmanuel Jacquet from Geneva International Peace Research Institute. He's the Vice President from Geneva. Good morning and welcome to the program. And I would start with Professor Tanjin. Now, sir, what role do non-tariff measures, such as the restrictions on U.S. businesses in China, play in China's relations strategy?
Well, China has been ready and preparing for this for the last 8 years. So everything has been kind of put in the equation. They are anticipating there could be tariffs from anywhere from nothing to 60%. Obviously, 20% is somewhere at the lower mid-range. You'll note that they have immediately set their own tariffs, especially on agricultural goods aimed at the heartland, which was an area of support for Donald Trump. And we'll see what comes after that, assuming that Trump retaliates. In terms of non-tariff goods, these are restrictions. They're exactly the same. The U.S. is intent on basically containing China, and this is part of Trump's game plan.
So Does the trade war between China and the United States affect the global economic stability, and what are the potential long-term consequences?
Good morning. Well, with regard to the consequences, many economists say that the consequences of the tariffs will be seen in April, especially in the Chinese economy. Now, given the fact as well that the world economy relies a lot on China as it's the factory of the world and the driving force of globalization, any serious crisis we could have in China would have global repercussions. And moreover, in this tit-for-tat game, on tariffs, it could harm both China and the US in the mid to long term as well. Moreover, both could try to harm each other, but there is always a limit that would be consequences created. Moreover, China could, for example, release the US bonds and debts on the market, and it could harm as well the US. So there'll be a tit for tat game, but we'll see where they will put the limits on how it will harm their respective economies.
Professor Tenjin, how does China's increasing defense budget reflect its stance on geopolitical tensions with the United States?
Well, I don't know where you get the sense that it's increasing. It's gone up by the exact same amount for the last 3 years. You can say it's increasing because it's a percentage of GDP of the budget, but is in essence just staying stable in terms of overall percentage. In terms of what China is hoping to do, they want to make it clear that they're not going to be, subject to another century of humiliation. This is very much uppermost in the Chinese mind. They do not want to be dominated by a colonial power that is reasserting itself as an empire by saying it's going to take lands from South America, Europe, even Canada, Gaza. These are the marks of an expansionist empire that has no regard for the rules of law or international system. So they're just making sure that it's clear that they're not going to be a patsy and they're not going to roll over.
Professor Jacquet, what role does the Indo-Pacific region play in the current China-US geopolitical tensions, especially the economic and trade tensions?
Well, it's a big question. We'll see, first of all, what will be the impact of this tit-for-tat game and how China and the US will adapt, how they'll be affected, and which sectors they'll try to strengthen. Now, more generally, we know that for Donald Trump, but as well more generally for the US, let's say, system, it's important to uphold the position of economic leadership of primacy in the system. And President Trump made it clear before that too much power was given to China. So he would like to, let's say, regain this US trade primacy in the world. And it could be a way maybe to contain Chinese expansion in the Asia Pacific, not just, let's say, the more traditional political or security expansion of China, but as well the economic and trade expansion in the region.
Professor Tenjin, in your own opinion, how might China's efforts to diversify its export markets mitigate the effects of US tariffs?
Well, that's been coming on for a long time. The largest trade partner is ASEAN, and you'll see that there's a correlation between increased trade with China and ASEAN and increased ASEAN trade with the rest of the world, especially Europe and America. I reject my colleagues' kind of inference that this is somehow a tit for tat. The aggressor here is the United States, and that's quite clear. China has responded, but not escalated. So this idea that somehow China is involved is nonsense. The fact is that the most difficult parts of this is going to be faced by the United States, by the consumers there. I'll give you a perfect example. Steel and aluminum. The last aluminum factory in America was built 40 years ago. U.S. is the largest importer of steel and aluminum. It is already, its current factories, its existing capacity is running at over 90% for both. So it cannot satisfy its own demand. It's just going to increase prices across the board, but it's not going to stop the U.S. from importing. They just import less because there'll be less demand. So this is, Donald Trump has not thought through any of his policies. He's a veritable economic retard, and he's being advised by people who have extreme agendas and no credibility.
Professor Jacquet, what are the key challenges facing negotiations aimed at resolving the trade war between China and the United States now?
Well, in terms of challenges as well, these negotiations can be impacted by other issues as well. Should it be regional issues in the Asia Pacific, or more generally as well, how, let's say, global power is now divided anew between China, Russia, and the US in what looks like a new Yalta. I guess for the US, once again, it's about trying to impose this US primacy and to control again China's economy as it used to be, for example. I mean, controlling, rather saying being the investor and being influential on this market as it used to be in the previous decades, or for example, under President Clinton. Once again, I think we have to look at Donald Trump's rhetoric. He's very provocative, and it's often for him a way to start negotiations. But usually, if he's confronted to strong or bold, let's say, partners or counterparts, usually he may double down and he may propose something else.
Professor Tanjin, in what ways could the trade war impact China's Made in China 2025 initiative, and how might this affect the global industrial competition?
Well, the global industrial competition has been won by China. I mean, it's 35% of the world's manufacturing. It's 30% of the world's growth. This is not a contest between the US and China on that level. What it is the United States, is, as a colleague has said, is trying to dominate not only the world, but also what it sees as a peer competitor, and that is China. China will continue to trade. They will continue to have breakthroughs, as we have seen, both in culture with their blockbuster movies and their video games, but also in technology, whether it's new electric vehicles or DeepSeek. China has the upper hand in part because it has the brain power, the manpower. It has 7 times the number of engineers in critical areas and the ability to take ideas and put them into the market. So China is.
This was illustrated in the last AI that was released, yes.
This AI has upended the valuations of US companies, assumed that they could follow the US pharmaceutical model, which was basically we will create IP and then we will, basically extract whatever value we can from either internally or externally. China has a different philosophy. They went to an open AI system, which basically, it's like sharing a huge public library as opposed to trying to create one that you can use, you and your clients can use exclusively. Obviously, the markets have reacted to that, and the valuations of these other companies have gone down dramatically.
Professor Jacquet, what role does technological competition play in the escalating tensions between China and the United States?
Well, technology is a big issue as well. China was an important producer, but we know as well that in the high-tech sector, the US are important, very instrumental. And there'll be competition, I guess, as well on electronic batteries because they account for 56% of Chinese export to the US. So you have electronic batteries, cell phones, they account for 45% of Chinese exports to the US. Computers as well, 26%, or even insulated wires. So these items as well exported to the US, very important for the US high-tech industry. And it would be, I guess, better for President Trump to have the control as well over this production and to maybe re-export it to the rest of the world. But there is one thing here. It's as well the cost differentials between the US and China. And right now it's more in favor of China.
Professor Tanjin, how might China leverage its Belt and Road Initiative to counterbalance US trade pressures?
Well, that's one of the great misunderstandings. The Belt and Road Initiative is an idea you can join, or in the case of Panama, you can be forced to move away from it by the United States. But in the end, it's simply about connectivity and trade. The idea that if you build the infrastructure, your country can now export and import what is needed to create a path to development. So, the U.S. can try to attack the Belt and Road Initiative, but it's not going to work simply because it's an idea and you can't kill an idea. In terms of how this plays into China, they have over 120 countries, they are the primary trade partner with on either exports or imports. And this has to do with the efficiency of the Chinese economy. They build products that people want. So this idea that somehow this is going to change because Donald Trump wants to throw a tariff tantrum is ridiculous.
Professor Jacquet, how could the United States respond to Beijing's threats in the trade arena?
Brilliant. I didn't understand well the question.
Well, I was asking you, sir, how could the United States respond to Beijing's threats in the trade arena?
Well, more tariffs in the end would be detrimental for China, but as well for the US. They may use different tools to pressurize China. Remember that under the previous Trump administration as well, we had a similar, let's say, trade war, and you had one of the Huawei heads who had been arrested. Similar tools could be used. There could be a game of pressure on China, but I don't know to which extent it will work, because for China as well, there is a vital issue. The Chinese economy needs to boost as well demand and consumption. You have a property crisis and unemployment. So for China, it could be very, I guess, difficult and detrimental to its interest to accept US sanctions. Maybe as well there'll be from the part of the US other moves like strengthening some trade agreements or trade blocks in Asia. But once again, the US could be limited as well in this endeavor by its WTO membership.
Professor Tenjin, what strategies can China employ to reduce its dependence on the US trade?
Well, I agree with my colleague in the sense that China has to increase the amount of domestic consumption, but it has the room to do that. Last year, disposable income, in addition to everything you had the previous year that you can spend the way you want, increased by 5%. Compare that to the US and Europe, which were completely anemic, around 1% or less than that. And then last year saved 45%. So there's a tremendous amount of money around. Its question is of confidence. And what you saw here in the two sessions was the Chinese government showing a lot of confidence. They have said, look, it's just steady going ahead. We have our plan. If the US wants to do what it does, we are not going to be swayed by it. They used a number of poetry lines to make sure that it's understood that China is a rock and it is not going to be swayed by wind or water from the outside. So this is China's main strategy, is to get its economy going, something that it can control. You can't control the global economy.
Professor Jacquet, in what ways might the ongoing trade tensions exacerbate both U.S. inflation?
Well, they could have as well, for sure, an impact on these moves can have an impact on U.S. Inflation next couple of weeks or months. Now it will be, I guess, a big issue for President Trump. If you remember well, in his current and his previous program, you had as well to make America great again in terms of providing employment to people. It's part of his, let's say, strategy to revive this American dream. So if he's not able to provide more jobs, if prices are going up in the next months as well, it's going to be very difficult for him, and it could have an impact on on the midterm elections as well in a few years. So this economic rivalry with China, or trade rivalry with China, sorry, is very vital for him as well, because most of its program is based as well on economic recovery.
Professor Tanjin, how is China positioning itself as a stable force in global trade relations amid the trade tensions and shifts in U.S. trade policy?
It is simply continuing to be this kind of rock. It's stable, it's predictable, it continues to output good products. This is all that China can do. I mean, they have this dual circulation strategy, which emphasizes domestic consumption that then attracts foreign investment because they see the market opportunities based on everything I've just said. But you know, the United States is it's not a question of if. I used to run elections in the US, and I can tell you, quite frankly, people vote with their book. So in the midterm elections, he's going to get a drubbing. There's already been this month a sharp increase in the number of people laid off, 275,000 jobs. The markets are watching that, in addition to the prices going up, with no end in sight. Current valuations say somewhere between $1,100 and $1,200 per household in a place where 70% of Americans prior to the election, American households, felt that they were living paycheck to paycheck. You don't have the same situation in China.
So the internal economic situation in the United States is actually playing a big role in this tension.
Absolutely. China is looking on as basically Donald Trump sacrifices the very people who voted for him. And they can see quite clearly that he's undermining himself. He's bluffing. He doesn't have the economic wherewithal to do exactly what he's trying to do, which is restart and reindustrialize the American economy. That would take years, and I mean tens of years, to accomplish. It would take a tremendous amount of investment. What businessman is going to invest in a country that's being politicized, and where the leader of that is going to be around effectively maybe for only 2 years, in person for only 4. So this isn't going to work out for the United States. It's just simply Donald Trump being Donald Trump, throwing things against the wall, seeing what happens and trying to make deals.
Well, that was Professor Einar Tanjin, Senior Fellow at Taihe Institute. Thank you very much, Professor, and also Professor Gil Emmanuel Jacquet, Geneva International Peace Research Institute Vice President. Thank you very much, Professors, for your valuable insights. And this brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. I'm Hala Al-Hamalawi. Thank you very much for joining us today, and stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.